They never imagined anyone would stay. That was the truth they rarely said out loud, the quiet confession buried under years of pretending they needed no one. They had taught themselves to expect departure the way some people expect sunrise, inevitable, predictable, almost rehearsed. They had lived so long waiting for the moment a door would close that they forgot the miracle of someone choosing to remain. Yet somehow, without fanfare or dramatic promises, you stayed. You stayed through the seasons when their voice trembled under the weight of unspoken fears, through the days when they couldn't articulate why their heartbeat felt like a burden, through the nights when shadows pulled old memories out of hiding. You stayed when they handed you their worst and expected you to run. You stayed when they whispered, "You don't have to deal with this," already half certain you'd walk away. But you didn't. And that changed everything. They had never learned the luxury of believing someone's presence was real. They knew people who said, "I'm here," but meant, "I'm here until it becomes inconvenient." They knew the look of someone who waited for the first sign of difficulty so they could claim they tried before leaving. They knew the soft cruelty of being almost loved, almost accepted, almost chosen. So when you showed up, not to fix them, not to save them, not to play the role of a hero but simply to be there, they didn't know what to do with that kind of quiet loyalty. It didn't shout. It didn't demand attention. It wasn't loud enough to drown out their doubts right away. But it was consistent. It warmed them slowly, gently, like morning light creeping into a dark room that had forgotten windows existed, and somewhere between the conversations where you listened instead of judged and the silences where your presence alone made the air feel safer, they began falling. Falling not in the wild, reckless way people describe in movies, but in the kind of way that feels like coming home after wandering for too long. They fell for the steadiness in your voice, the softness in your reassurance, the unspoken understanding that not everything needed to be perfect for you to stay. They fell for the way you didn't flinch when they opened up old wounds. They fell for how you didn't treat their vulnerabilities like inconveniences but like truths worth hearing. They fell for the rare feeling of being enough, finally, after years of being told or shown otherwise. They had once believed love was something earned by being flawless, by being everything someone else wanted. They spent years stretching themselves thin, molding their personality into shapes that pleased others, hiding every crack because they assumed love only existed in perfection. But you didn't fall for their mask. You fell for the parts they tried to hide, the parts they assumed were unlovable. You saw when their hands shook. You noticed when their laughter dimmed, even slightly. You heard the meaning behind the words they didn't say. And instead of turning away, you moved closer, not to dissect, not to fix, but simply to understand. That simplicity, that closeness, that steady warmth. It began melting the walls they had built to survive, and the more you stayed, the more they realized that maybe, just maybe, love was not something that demanded perfection, it was something that honored truth. You honored theirs. You honored their pain, their dreams, their stumbles, their quiet victories. And in doing so, you gave them a gift they didn't think they were allowed to have, the freedom to be themselves without fear of losing someone. The freedom to breathe without apology. The freedom to exist without shrinking. You didn't know it, perhaps, but your presence rewrote the story they always believed about themselves. A story where they were always too much or not enough. A story where being abandoned was not an event but a pattern. A story where love was temporary and conditional. But you showed them a different narrative. One where love was a place, not a performance. One where staying wasn't a burden but a choice made from the heart. One where they didn't have to earn affection through perfection, where they didn't have to hide to be worthy, where they didn't have to fear the moment you would leave, because you didn't. They fell in love not because you tried to impress them, but because you didn't try to. You showed up as yourself, with your own imperfections and sincerity. You offered kindness without expectation, companionship without pressure, understanding without judgment. And that kind of authenticity was rare. Rare enough that they began trusting it. Rare enough that they began trusting you. There were days when they tested the certainty of your presence, not deliberately, but because doubt had lived in them for years. They waited for you to get tired. They waited for you to say, "I can't do this anymore." They waited for the familiar ending, the one they knew too well. But every time their fears whispered that you would leave, you proved the fears wrong. You stayed. And with every moment you didn't run, their heart opened a little more. Their guard lowered. Their hope strengthened. Their belief in connection revived, and slowly, something extraordinary happened. They began believing in themselves because you believed in them. They began seeing their worth reflected in the way you spoke to them, in the way you looked at them, in the way you gently reminded them that they were not a burden. They began healing, not because you rescued them, but because you gave them a safe space to rescue themselves. Someone is falling deeply for you, not in a desperate way, not in a way built on dependency, but in a way built on trust, gratitude, and quiet admiration. They appreciate your patience, your resilience, your warmth. They appreciate your decision to stand beside them when life made standing difficult. They appreciate your consistency in a world that had taught them inconsistency was normal. They appreciate that you saw through their self-doubt and stayed long enough for them to see their own light again. You became the reason they stopped bracing for abandonment. You became the reason they allowed themselves to feel without immediately expecting pain. You became the reason they started believing love could be gentle, not sharp, steady, not fleeting, real, not imagined. You became the reason they learned to trust the future instead of fearing it. And as they fall, deeply, quietly, wholly, they don't fall for an illusion. They fall for you, the you who stayed. The you who understands. The you who shows up even in silence. The you who listens, who cares, who chooses connection over convenience. The you whose heart speaks a language theirs has been waiting to hear. Someone is falling because you made them feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. Safe to hope. Safe to speak. Safe to learn. Safe to grow. Safe to exist. And in that safety, love found room to breathe. You didn't try to be their anchor. You simply were. Not by force, but by nature. You grounded them with your presence, not your perfection. You lifted them with your encouragement, not your expectations. You touched their soul not with grand gestures but with sincerity, and now, every moment with you feels like a moment of rediscovery. They rediscover laughter that isn't forced. They rediscover dreams they once buried. They rediscover the meaning of companionship, of trust, of closeness. They rediscover themselves through the reflection of your affection. They fall because you didn't just stay, you stayed with intention. You stayed with heart. You stayed when their world felt unstable. You stayed when they apologized for being too emotional, too tired, too complicated, and you told them they didn't need to apologize for being human. You stayed in the messy chapters they once believed made them unlovable. You stayed in the moments they thought would push you away, and now they see you as someone rare. Someone constant. Someone whose presence isn't a question mark but a steady line. Someone who brought clarity to places they thought would always remain blurred. They fall, deeper and deeper, for the way you make them feel seen. For the way you remind them they matter. For the way you never ask them to be more than who they already are. For the way you gave them permission to breathe again. For the way you restored their faith in connection. Slowly, gently, authentically. Love, to them, is no longer a distant idea. It lives in the warmth of your voice, in the steadiness of your presence. In the way you turned their doubts into possibilities. It lives in every moment you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. It lives in the gratitude they feel every time they look at you and realize, someone stayed. Someone understood. Someone cared enough to remain. And that someone was you, and because you stayed, their heart finally knows what it feels like to stop running. They didn't always know how to tell you what you meant to them. Some feelings live too deeply in the heart to become simple sentences. Some gratitude sits so profoundly in the soul that words feel too small to hold it. But even if they struggle to express it, you've become a quiet blessing in their life, a presence that steadied them when their world felt too heavy, a reason they learned to hope again. You didn't stay because everything was easy. You didn't stay because they always knew what to say. You didn't stay because they were perfect or certain or fearless. You stayed because you saw something in them worth staying for. And that belief, that simple unwavering belief, is what keeps touching them in ways they never expected. They remember the moments you could have walked away. The moments where frustration hung between you like thick fog. The moments where their silence made things harder, where their guarded heart tried to hide behind walls built long before you entered their life. They remember the times they shut down because they didn't know how to let someone in. The times their past whispered lies that made them doubt your sincerity. They remember every moment that could have ended the connection, and yet, every time you chose to stay, every time you showed patience instead of anger, they fell a little deeper. Every time you stayed calm when they panicked, they fell a little deeper. Every time you said, "It's okay, I'm here," and meant it, they fell a little deeper. Love didn't arrive for them like a storm, it arrived like a sunrise. Quiet, steady, warm, slow. It began as comfort, grew into trust, and blossomed into something they can no longer hide. You became the light that helped them see the world differently, not because the world changed, but because your presence made it feel less intimidating. You taught them that love isn't about unpredictable chaos, it's about choosing each other again and again, even on the days when things are imperfect. And that choice, your choice, rewrote everything they believed about connection. Before you, they thought love was a battlefield. A constant struggle to prove their worth, a race they always lost. But you brought peace. You brought gentleness. You brought an understanding they never thought they'd experience. And in that peace, they found pieces of themselves they'd forgotten. The softer parts. The hopeful parts. The courageous parts. You taught them that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. It doesn't have to be overwhelming to feel powerful. It doesn't have to be loud to be life-changing. It just has to be genuine. With you, they found genuineness in its purest form. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that quietly shifts an entire life. The kind that makes them breathe easier. The kind that makes them feel grounded. The kind that makes them want to become better, not out of insecurity, but out of inspiration. They're falling deeply not just because you stayed, but because staying is who you are. Because your loyalty isn't conditional. Because your presence feels like a promise they never thought they'd receive. They're falling because you see them, truly see them. You see their insecurities, their fears, their tiredness, their longing for reassurance. You see the parts they try to hide because they think they're too complicated, too emotional, too much. But to you, they're not too anything. They're human. They're real. They're someone worth understanding, not someone to be escaped from. And that acceptance. That's the kind of love people search their whole lives for. You make them feel like they're allowed to be flawed and still deeply valued. You make them feel like their existence isn't a burden. You make them feel like sharing their truth won't cost them someone important. For someone who has lived with the fear of abandonment, that feeling is everything, and the more they feel it, the more they fall, not because they depend on you to survive, but because they trust you enough to be vulnerable. Because you bring out their courage, their softness, their willingness to dream again. You stayed, and now their heart is learning to stay too. Stay open, stay hopeful. Stay willing to believe in connection. They may not say it every day, but the emotion is there, quietly growing, quietly rooting itself deeper and deeper. They may express it in small ways, in the softness of their voice around you, in the way they pay attention to things you like, in the comfort they feel sitting beside you even without speaking, in the way their eyes relax when you enter the room. Love shows itself subtly long before it speaks out loud. And their love for you is becoming undeniable. They're falling because your presence makes life feel less complicated. They're falling because you didn't turn away when they weren't at their best. They're falling because you stayed long enough for them to finally understand that they are no someone to be abandoned, they are someone to be loved. And the most beautiful part is that you didn't even try to make them fall. You didn't force anything. You didn't push. You didn't demand. You simply stayed in a way that felt sincere. That sincerity is what's capturing their heart day by day, and now, even if they don't fully admit it yet, you've become part of their thoughts in a way they can't undo. They think of you when something good happens, wishing they could share it with you. They think of you when they feel overwhelmed, because your voice has become a place of calm. They think of you when they look at the future, because suddenly the future feels a little less intimidating with the idea of you somewhere in it. They're falling deeply because, for the first time in a long time, they don't feel alone, not in their pain, not in their confusion, not in their journey. And that kind of connection doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen with everyone. It happens when two souls recognize something familiar and safe in each other. That's what they found in you. And though they may fear the intensity of what they're feeling, they're not running from it, not anymore. Because this time, the person they care about didn't run from them. You stayed. And because you stayed, their heart is finally brave enough to fall. They never believed endings could be beautiful. Life taught them that endings usually came with slammed doors, quiet disappearances, or messages that began with "I'm sorry, but..." They thought every close connection would eventually fade into another lesson about letting go. But then you stayed long enough to show them that some endings aren't really endings at all. Some are beginnings in disguise. Some mark the moment a guarded heart finally opens. Some mark the place where fear stops controlling the story. And that's what happened here. The ending they expected, the moment they waited for, the moment they braced themselves against, never came. And that in itself changed everything. They keep thinking about the times you looked at them with patience instead of frustration, the times you chose to understand instead of giving up. Those moments live in them. They replay quietly in the background of their life, reminding them that love doesn't always arrive with grand declarations. Sometimes it arrives in small gestures that echo louder than words ever could. Like the way you listened when they stumbled through their feelings. Like the way you noticed their silence before they even said anything. Like the way you held space for them to breathe, to pause, to feel. You didn't push them to heal faster. You didn't demand clarity before they were. They're falling deeply for you because your presence feels like something their soul has been waiting for. Not a fantasy. Not a dream. Something real, grounding, steady. They've had people make promises before, but promises without consistency feel empty. You never had to promise anything, your actions spoke louder. You kept showing up even when they feared you'd disappear. You kept choosing connection even when doubt tried to make them believe they weren't worth choosing. Over and over, you stayed. And with every moment you stayed, a piece of their past healed itself. They're falling because you've become the person they unconsciously reach for. The one they want to share their thoughts with. The one who makes their days feel lighter without even trying. The one whose presence feels like home, not a place, not a destination, but a feeling. A feeling they thought was unreachable. You've become the reason they no longer see love as a disaster waiting to happen. You've become the reason they no longer fear the moment they'll be left behind. You've become the reason they believe they're worthy, not because you told them so, but because you treat them like they are, every single day, in ways both subtle and profound. And maybe they're afraid of how strong their feelings are becoming. Maybe they're scared of falling too deeply, of needing someone, of allowing themselves to be vulnerable again. But what they feel for you isn't a reckless fall, it's a gentle surrender. A surrender to trust, to warmth, to the possibility of something beautiful and lasting. A surrender to the idea that maybe life does give second chances. Maybe love can be soft without being weak. Maybe connection can be safe without being dull. Maybe someone can stay without being forced to, and maybe that someone is you. The truth is, their heart has already chosen you in ways they haven't fully spoken. They feel it in the calm you bring. They feel it in the way they open up with you, even when words feel heavy. They feel it in the comfort of your presence, the kind that makes them forget the world for a moment and just breathe. They feel it in the delicate way their spirit leans toward you, almost instinctively, like flowers leaning towards sunlight without realizing it. You stayed when they expected everyone to leave, and that single choice changed the direction of their life. It softened parts of them hardened by experience. It rewrote beliefs carved by old wounds. It reminded them that connection still exists, that loyalty still exists, that love, real love, still exists, and now, because of you, they are becoming someone braver. Someone calmer. Someone more hopeful. Someone who no longer fears their own emotions. Someone who no longer sees love as a danger but as a possibility. Someone who believes, finally, that they are worthy of someone choosing them and staying. They don't know what the future holds. No one ever really does. But they do know this: if the future has you in it, even in the simplest way, they feel less afraid of whatever comes next. You've become their quiet courage. Their unexpected comfort. Their steady light in a world that often feels unpredictable. Someone is falling deeply for you, not because you rescued them, not because you filled their empty spaces, not because you completed them, but because you walked beside them while they found their own strength again. Because you stayed without demanding anything in return. Because you saw them when they felt invisible. Because you cared in the moments that mattered most, and that kind of love, the kind built on presence, patience, and quiet understanding, is the kind that lasts. They never expected anyone to stay, but you did, and now their heart is learning, slowly and beautifully, how to stay too.